Welcome in to One of One Sports. This is a channel that will be dedicated to covering the sports world in a way which is both intellectually honest and thoughtful. Because college football season is about to start, the focus for the near future will be on college football content. But going forward, there'll be NBA content, college basketball content, and coming very soon, NFL content. But we'll begin with today's video, a college football theory on returning production. So the genesis of this video stems from a simple observation. A few weeks back, I began researching college football teams to begin making prediction videos for the upcoming season. These will be out shortly for you guys, but while doing so, I came across an article from last year. It's titled, "Florida State Returns the Most Production in 2023. Now, of course, knowing Florida State went 12-0 last year and was very good, I was curious. I decided to look in who are the other teams with the most production. And this is the top 10. Now, what jumps out at me is that Missouri, Florida State, and Michigan were all in this top 10. Michigan would go on to have a 15-0 season and win the national title. Florida State would be very successful being 12-0 and arguably should have been in the college football playoff. And then Missouri was one of the surprise teams in the country for many people. So now this led me to have a couple of questions. The first of my questions is very simple. What is returning production? Now, in this question, it's not the most straightforward answer. We'll need to know how it's measured, who's measuring it, and we'll get into all of that shortly. But first, my second question is, does it really matter? We saw obviously in that top 10 that some of those teams were very successful, but is there any actual correlation between having more returning production and being a good college football team? So let's start answering these questions. First, what is returning production? Well, in simple terms, it's just the percentage of snaps, yards, tackles, and all the various other stats included in a college football team that a team is bringing back from one season to the next. And then in terms of who's calculating this, it's Bill Connolly of ESPN. He gets a lot of data on all these teams, and he even includes information on transfers and weighting. So to demonstrate, for example, in his weighting, quarterback passing yards are weighted at 24%, while running back rushing yards are only valued at 5%. And this is calculated with a lot of analytic models determining what's the most important parts of a team are in college football. So he breaks all of this down, and then he gives a ranking 1 through 133 of all the teams returning production. So after seeing Bill Connolly's list from last year and seeing how well some of those teams performed, I was able to form a hypothesis. My hypothesis is that the higher percentage of returning production a college football team has, the more likely they are to see an increase in winning. Pretty simple, but a hypothesis alone is not worth anything. So we need to perform some tests to conclude on if this hypothesis holds any weight. So first up, we have a statistical test. So the parameters for this test, we're going to need random sampling of college football teams and their returning production, and then see how well those teams performed. And then we'll need a sample size of greater than or equal to 30. I'm not some analytical genius, but I did take AP statistics, and this is a pretty common rule to get the best data. And then ideally, you would have a sample size that is less than 10% of a population size, which would be like this formula here. Will we be able to meet these requirements? Mostly. A random sample is pretty easy, and a sample size of greater than 30 is pretty easy. But because the way we'll perform this test is by taking 30 teams from the 2022 college football season and testing them, and there's only 133 FBS teams, we don't actually meet the last requirement of 10 times the sample size, so the results will not be, or the test is not as ideal as we would like it to be, but it'll still work for general purposes. So using these parameters, for the most part, I was able to make a test. I generated 30 random college football teams, found out what their returning production was going into the college football season in 2022, and then found out how much their wins increased or decreased by in the following season, and here were the results. First up, I have a graph here showing percentage of improvement on the y-axis, and then your percentage of returning production on the x-axis, and then the p-value for this graph. So what a p-value is is basically if we were to assume that there was no relationship between these things, what's the chance of getting the results here? So basically, there's less than a 1% chance of getting the results found in this random 30 sample if we were to assume there's no correlation. So this is statistically significant and shows there's a pretty clear positive correlation between greater returning production percentage and then your percentage improvement. And you guys can see on the chart, past that 80% returning production point seems to be a line of demarcation showing what's really significant for a team to bring back. I also did tests on just your net improvement in wins, not on percentage improvement, so just your total win improvement. And once again, it's a p-value that is statistically significant, though not as statistically significant as if we used percentage improvement. But once again, the line of demarcation at around 80 is pretty clear for those same few teams. And you still see a clear positive correlation between your percentage of returning production and your improvement in terms of wins. So moving forward, I look to see, are there any possible conclusions we can draw from this, which will be meaningful. So first, in drawing conclusions, I looked at what are the top 10 teams in 2024 in returning production that maybe we could see have a high chance of improvement. So here are the top 10 teams and then their overall percentage of improvement. Iowa State leads the country with 86, but also in the top 10 you have South Florida at 79, and you guys can see the whole list here. So on the surface, we would think that these 10 teams are likely to improve, especially the ones above 80%, as we saw in the graphs. Random sample of 30 teams, it looked like 80% marked that you are pretty likely to improve. So, but this is 10 teams, and it's not very likely that all 10 teams see major improvement. So to determine which teams will see the most improvement we need to do further testing. So for further testing, I broke up the overall returning production into offense and defense. And what I found was pretty interesting. If we look at offense at the same graph for percentage improvement, the p-value actually now indicates there's over an 8% chance, which for most tests would not be considered statistically significant. But for defense, once again, less than a 1% chance. So this actually shows that returning defense production based on our sample, and we can't, say for sure, we can't, it's not conclusive, but it would just suggest that defense returning production holds more weight and is more valuable than offensive returning production. So now we can use this to try to narrow down our list of 10 teams to see who's set up the best to see a major increase in wins and percentage improvement in 2024. So here are 10 teams once again. First things first, for this upcoming season, I wanted to focus on the Power 4 teams. So we're going to remove Rice, Hawaii, and South Florida. And so that already narrows down our search for a team that'll see the most improvement to 7 teams. Now, if we add in yellow, you guys can see this is their defense returning production. So Virginia Tech and Virginia are below that 80% line that seemed to be that line of demarcation. So we're going to remove them from our group, and we've narrowed it down to our final 5 teams. Iowa State, Oklahoma State, Stanford, Iowa, and Baylor are the 5 most likely teams to see the largest percentage improvement based on our test. But so how can we narrow this down to just one final team? If we think about this, Oklahoma State was already at 10 wins last year, so there's not enough room for improvement to see a large percentage. Same with Iowa, so both those teams can be removed. Next up, now that we have 3 down, we see Baylor at 79 is a little under 80, so that suggests maybe they're not the most likely. But then thinking about this critically, Stanford and Baylor only had 3 wins each last year, so they're returning players that weren't performing even at a mediocre level. So if we're thinking about it that way, we would assume that they're not going to see the largest increase since they're returning players that weren't very good. So I'm going to eliminate Baylor from Stanford, and I believe that the Iowa State Cyclones, based on our gathering of data tests, and drawing conclusions, are the team most likely to see the largest percentage improvement in wins in 2024. Iowa State was a 7-win team last year. I believe that based on this data and the results that we saw from it, we can expect them to improve to at least a 9 or an 8-win team in 2024. This makes them a very underrated team, as they do not appear in the preseason top 25 for the AP poll, making them a prime candidate for this year's surprise team and a dark horse playoff contender. I thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon.